Hello and welcome to another episode of the Energy Talk podcast. My name is Olupumi Olajide and thank you so much for joining us again this week. I hope you're all staying safe. Some good news around the world as lockdowns are beginning to get phased out in some places. If you're in one of those places, I hope that you're enjoying the renewed freedom, and if you're not, I hope that we reach that place for all of us very soon. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about the effects of Covid-19 on the oil and gas markets. We're going to be looking specifically on how we got to the ridiculous headlines of negative oil prices a few months ago, or last month, I should say. And we're going to be looking at how this affects the broader oil and gas markets and what this would mean for the industry going forward. Joining us to have this conversation is Mikulska. She is an energy policy analyst and a fellow at the Climate Center for Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania, and a non-resident fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Energy Policy. So she's been on the podcast before, and we look forward to her sharing her insights with us. So let's jump right into the conversation, and I hope you enjoy this one. Hello, Anna. Thank you so much for joining me again on the podcast. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. So this is the second time I'm having you on the podcast, and what we're going to talk about is something that is very recent events. Last time we talked about energy and climate policy, but now we're talking about the impact of COVID on the oil and gas market. So should we jump into it?
I guess we can.
Yeah. So I think the first thing is, how did we get here? How did we get into the current issue that we're in right now with all that's going on in the oil and gas industry and in the world in general?
Mm-hmm. Well, we got ourselves into a pandemic, and that kind of changed our calculus, right, of how things are done, not necessarily only in the oil and gas industry, but generally in terms of our lives. That's the first time we've ever been in a situation really like that, where basically, a huge amount of globe's population, I think, over a half is some type of a lockdown, under some type of a lockdown situation, and which basically means that our economic activity has gone down tremendously. And that means that if we do not have that economic activity going on, when the energy levels, the energy demand has also plunged. And I think it's estimated that about a quarter of global energy demand, total energy demand, we lost a quarter of total energy demand in the first quarter of 2020. So these are huge numbers, and that obviously will reflect on how oil and gas demand and oil and gas industry is doing all over the world.
Okay. So is it fair to say that the oil and gas industry kind of dug themselves deeper into this? Like, apart from the obvious impact of the coronavirus causing the lockdown and reduced demand, there's also what happened with the disagreements between Russia and some of the members in OPEC. So do you think that kind of like made worse situations even much worse, or how far do you think that affected, or do you think it was inevitable either way?
I think at the time that Saudi Arabia and Russia have decided that it might be a good time for a price war in terms of oil, they did not realize how bad the pandemic will be, even though it was so close. That was a surprise, and that's why we saw basically both of the countries stepping back and getting back to negotiating tables so quickly. When the oil price war started, there were expectations that it can take forever, that both of the countries can duck in forever because they can afford doing so. But the reality on the ground that has been, related to the pandemic and the economic and general lockdown of world's population, really quickly adjusted that behavior. And part of it was that whatever volumes that were produced, for example, by Saudi Arabia or Russia, they just did not have place to be absorbed, and because of that, the price war could not really continue. The countries could not just keep producing and producing because there was no no market to sell even a very, very cheap oil to. And we've seen that. We've seen this, a huge amount of oil being released to the economies, not being able sometimes to find place to store because because economies were not working strong enough to use it. There was and the storage the available storage has been declining, which basically meant that at some point we even saw negative prices on WTI, something that has never happened before, and that's for the future, of course, for the future delivery.
So going to these negative prices, that sounds like something that will go down in history for quite a long time now. So how do negative prices even happen in the first place?
Right. So the important fact to understand is that the negative prices we've seen haven't been generally for pricing of oil. They have been those prices related only to WTI. For example, not to Brent oil, and also they were for future delivery. They were future prices, and that makes a big difference. They were not spot prices at that time when we recorded them, and it basically meant that we had a disturbance in the market within specific market, and the U.S. market, where Cushing, Oklahoma, was not able to absorb a large amount of crude that would have to be delivered there because of the storage levels already being quite filled up. And whatever wasn't really filled up, it was already contracted for specific storage needs, and that's where we've seen those negative pricing. We do not see this happening really now for June delivery, and that's because several mechanisms have been adopted not to allow buyers kind of wait for a long time until they would have to actually physically absorb the oil volumes from the futures.
Okay, so that's very interesting. But now a different angle that people may not be very may not be very obvious as a result of everything. People kind of understand the concept of how oil is produced and the need to store oil. But when you talk about natural gas, it's kind of a different situation in some places because in the first place, has the drop in demand been the same for natural gas as it's been for the oil demand?
So we have seen a drop in demand, but the factors that are related to the drop of demand in gas that we've seen are different than the drop of demand for oil. And I think that's the important part to understand. Good portion of drop in demand of oil has been related to drop in the transportation needs, right? So that's where we see, because of COVID and a lockdown and a global lockdown, really of many economies. Now for natural gas, there has been different factors that kind of are mixed into that really general trend. So what we have seen oversupply, or maybe we have seen a large supply of natural gas coming into the markets at the beginning of 2020 that has been related really to especially the beginning, not as much to COVID as the fact that we have had a relatively warm winter. So we haven't seen as much of gas being absorbed into the economies for purposes of heating. And also, we have seen slower than expected natural gas demand from Asian economies, and particularly from China. So we've seen that kind of larger supply coming in, and then you ended up with prices being adjusted downwards based on that large supply hitting the markets. In addition, for example, in Europe, where a lot of storage for gas actually exists, you've seen that storage levels being filled up more than usually they would be at this time of the year, and that relates to also other factors. So warm winters, actually one after another. So we had 2018 to 2019, that winter was very warm, and we already had high level of storage filled up. And then 2019, 2020, when 2020 winter was also warm, so you end up having storage being filled out to a higher amount. And on top of this, in Europe, because there was this uncertainty about continuing transit of Russian gas via Ukraine, a lot of European storage was filled up actually to a higher level, just in case there would be no agreement between Russia and Ukraine to transit gas, and there would be less gas flowing from Russia beginning of 2020. That being said, that agreement was signed, and we've seen volumes of Russian gas actually being delivered via Ukraine. But we've seen that also the storage levels has been high. So there's this lot of things that kind of add to this. COVID will have an effect on natural gas demand, however, to somewhat lower degree. Natural gas is generally not a transportation fuel. In some instances, yes, but generally this is not the major function it fulfills. We see natural gas being used for heating purposes and for electricity generation. So we will see that, well, heating, we're going into the now, especially in our hemisphere, we're going into the portion of the year that heating is needs decrease. So we would see them lower anyways. But also, so we will see that the demand of gas demand for gas being hit to the level that electricity generation might be hit by the COVID pandemic.
So this is actually making me quite curious. Is the impact levels for gas being transported by pipelines, and that requires you to use tankers and go to terminal, is the impact the same? Is it uniformly felt, or is one more disproportionately hit than the other?
We've seen actually pipeline gas, particularly in Europe, being hit more than LNG. And that's for several reasons. One reason, big reason, has been that LNG has been very well priced, especially spot LNG. It has been well priced considering, this oversupply of the market, or huge supply coming into the market, and prices falling on the spot in terms of spot pricing. But also the contracts that European countries have signed with Russia, its major supplier for the most part, but also other countries like Norway, have become increasingly flexible for pipeline gas. So basically, which meant that now those pipeline gas buyers were able to look into the arbitrage between very low spot pricing of LNG and higher pricing of pipelines that is often based on long-term contracts, and decide that because now they have the flexibility to refuse some of this contracted pipeline gas coming in, that they will not bring it, and then they will instead import the spot cargoes because they are so low prices. So they basically were performing arbitrage and getting the cheaper gas. And we have seen this. We have actually seen a record amount of LNG coming into Europe over the first quarter of 2020. And that's related also to the fact that the prices between Europe and Asia in terms of LNG spot price became the same. And at the same time, going to Asia involves higher transportation cost. So a lot of those those cargoes that otherwise would be going to Asia ended up in Europe. In addition, Europe has a large gas storage capacity, which, even though filled out to relatively high levels, has been able to absorb a lot of this gas in the first quarter. Now, Going into the second quarter, the situation probably will change, particularly for LNG, and we already seen LNG cargoes cancellations from Europe as well, as some predict that the storage levels might fill up by the summer in Europe. So you will end up with a much tighter market there, and inability to store more gas at some point.
So what about in terms of the future effect of this? Is it something that we see go back to normal very quickly once the lockdowns around the world become lifted? And do you see them as things going back to normal, or do you think that it still take a while for things to kind of like fall into place, certain factors, before we can go back to business as usual? Or is there going to be a business as usual at the end of this?
So I don't think there's going to be really business as usual as soon as we get out of the lockdown mode. That's not probably the case. The economies have been hit quite hard. The demand will take a while to recover, but even if their demand recovers relatively quickly, we do have a huge overhang of both oil and gas supply. So before we go back to, possibly higher prices of oil or gas, we will also have to get rid of this overhang of oil and gas and so on. In addition to this, you will have a lot of countries having, what usually only Saudi Arabia kind of could really, in terms of oil, could really have, it's that spare capacity. A lot of spare capacity for oil production is there. So not only you have storage levels, filled storage levels that need to be distributed to the economy for prices to pick up, but also later on you have a lot of potential production standing by and ready to hop into the market, and that will also depress the price levels. Same goes for natural gas to an extent, but also when you look at the recovery, and that would be in the best case scenario if after the lockdown you have very quick recovery to normal in terms of generally all economy, but that's also not what is expected. When we look at the predictions, we will, from different agencies, economic agencies, trade agencies, and oil and gas agencies or energy agencies, we see that what's predicted is rather slower recovery, not this V-shaped recovery of economy. and part of it is going to be, even if we get over the lockdown, especially for energy and for transportation, we might see this prolonged effect of the pandemic, in that some people will keep working from home for a longer period of time, that some business travel will be curtailed, that tourist travel might be curtailed, will be slower for significant amount of time. So we will see that economic recovery in general will be slower, and that oil and gas demand and oil and gas pricing recovery might be even slower because of that overhang of demand and potentially, additional production sitting on standby and able to step in whenever. Otherwise, we would have a signal for higher pricing. That being said, this is not necessarily a bad thing for everybody, that cheap, low pricing, because when you think about the countries importing gas and oil, that might help their economic recovery. Cheaper energy prices can potentially spur economic recovery, and that kind of help generally recover from the pandemic. In terms of natural gas, there is this consideration when natural gas could benefit from coal to gas switching in electricity generation. That remains to be seen, because what I'm talking about is a relatively short-term view. Going, into long-term view, we see that disruption from pandemic as a short-term occurrence going into the end of the decade, beginning of end of the 2020s, beginning of 2030s. We probably we expect still the demand for especially gas going up. Also in terms of oil, most likely, and because of that, we need to kind of distinguish between the short-term or even short to mid-term effect and long-term trends in oil and gas demand and where they will be happening.
So kind of as a final question, what do you think the key takeaways will be from the last few months? What has it really taught the oil and gas industry in terms of how they're going to go with business operations in the future? And do you think there are any positives to take out of what has been happening so far?
So it is a very difficult time for oil and gas industry, but it's really difficult time for any industry nowadays. And some industries have been hit much harder than oil and gas industry. And, airline industry, right? For example, airline industry, tourism, hotels, all this has been hit pretty much more than oil and gas industry has been hit. And it will continue to be affected by the pandemic going forward. And the interesting part for that is that really oil and gas industry is used to cyclical kind of, booms and busts. So so I feel that they kind of almost better prepared than other industries to kind of take any type of lessons or any type of factors that are happening now and kind of translate them later into potential growth. We will see mergers and acquisitions happening, so you will see kind of consolidation in the industry going forward, that's for sure. And because of that, you will probably see more efficiency. You will, and the thing is, even though we might see distress in the industry, the physical assets are there, right? So we will see that the physical assets, the oil and gas that's in the ground is there, and we will see that the infrastructure is there. So once the demand recovers, there'll be, I want to say, prepared to take advantage of that at some point. You will see some R&D happening, that's for sure, to kind of increase efficiency gains and so on as well. Then the question is the question of demand. We've been writing about the demand going forward and the fact that while we definitely see the world moving into less carbon intensive future, at least till 2040 or even further out, we don't see the world kind of completely weaning itself off of fossil fuels. We might see technology that helps decarbonizing the use of fossil fuels, and that would be a great way to kind of make sure that we supplement our efforts to bring in more renewables, zero carbon, zero emission fuels. I think that's very important, but it's very hard to imagine that we won't see oil demand and or gas demand going for the next 2 or 3 decades and so on. So I guess the industry is used to the cyclical kind of booms and busts, and we will see a lot of mergers and acquisitions, a lot of consolidation in industry and adjustment. That's for sure. It's not going to be the same industry the way it came into the pandemic, but I also don't expect it to disappear.
Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and more importantly, I hope you learned about the current situation the oil and gas industry is in. Thank you so much to Anna for being part of this episode. It's always a pleasure to speak with her. And if you have any feedback for us, please email us at energytalkpodcast@gmail.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, leave us a rating or a review, and follow us along on Twitter and Instagram at The Energy Talk, so you can be part of the conversation after the episode ends. So thank you so much again. I hope you all have a lovely week. This episode was produced by yours truly, and thanks to Jensen for the music used in this episode. Oh, and just as a side note for people who are still listening, this is our last official episode for the season. We will have a bonus episodes follow up this one, so you can look forward to that, and we'll give a few updates about a project we're working on that would serve as content while we work on season 3 for the podcast. And if you're still listening on to this point, then that means you must be one of the awesome people that support us, and thank you so much. It really means a lot to have you people come back every week, or sometimes a few times a week. It really means a lot. You made this project develop as much as it is right now, and we're really grateful for you, and we really look forward to how best we can improve and deliver the content to you better in the future. So thank you again. This is just an extra side note for the people who listen on to the end, and we will see you on the next episode, which is a bonus episode. And we all look forward to having you on there. Thank you again. Have a lovely day.